As we speak, many nations fighting for their freedom, for sovereignty, for independence, for territorial integrity.
We have Belarus, the most extraordinary example of persistent, peaceful, popular protest.
I was a student leader in the 2014 Umbrella Movement and then elected in 2016 as the youngest lawmaker in Hong Kong's history and being expelled from the council by the Chinese Communist Party and jailed in 2017.
I had a police protection for several weeks, and this was due to the possible threat from the Russian embassy.
It turns out that for democracy, people need to have access to factual reality where they live.
Being able to change something in this world, allowing these voices to be heard and seen through the big medium of the filmmaking.
Hello, and welcome back to CEPA Forum. For those of you who are just tuning in, my name is Geisha Gonzalez, and I am the Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Day 3 of the CEPA Forum, where we will be tackling democratic resilience in the face of authoritarianism. It is my pleasure to give a special thank you to our supporters, NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, American Friends of Czech Republic, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Bell Helicopter. And now, over to our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova.
Hello, and welcome to Day 3 of the 2020 CEPA Forum. Our focus today is the future of democracy in the 21st century. Authoritarian models pushed forward by Russia and China challenge the resilience of democratic institutions. And across the world, democratic societies face internal challenges. But democratic values and principles remain just as universally appealing today as they were in the 20th century. Today, we are proud to honor those fighting for democracy in Europe's frontline states. Our very first Freedom Fighter Award goes to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, Linas Linkevičius, for his work in mobilizing the international community in support of the Belarusian people's fight for freedom. My CEPA colleague, the wonderful Edward Lucas, will introduce Minister Linkevičius.
I'm Edward Lucas, Senior Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, and I'm delighted and honoured to be introducing Linas Linkevičius. He's the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania, and he's held many other important distinguished posts in his 30-year career of public service. But that's not exactly why we're honouring him today. Lithuania has been the spearhead of the international reaction to the crisis in Belarus. Lithuania has opened its borders to refugees fleeing the illegitimate, brutal regime of Alexander Lukashenko. Lithuania has championed the cause of the opposition. It's home to some of the most important opposition leaders now in exile. It's led the campaign for sanctions and for pressure, not just on the regime in Minsk, but also the regime in Moscow, which supports it. And at the heart of all those efforts is the figure of Linas Linkevičius. And this is all the more remarkable because other countries have not been so prominent in this, particularly at the beginning. It was Lithuania that grasped the drama, the sacrifice, the significance of what was happening in Belarus, the struggle for freedom in Europe's last dictatorship. Now, 30 years ago, Lithuanians were also at the forefront of world affairs. It was their brave unilateral declaration of the restoration of independence on March the 11th, 1990, that dealt the death blow to the evil empire of the Soviet Union. And now Lithuanians are doing it again. They're leading where others are sometimes too scared even to follow. They show brains, they show creativity, they show guts, they show determination. Now, I hope that when Belarus is free, there'll be streets named after Lithuania in big cities and towns and elsewhere. I actually think there should be a street, several, named after Linus Linkevičius, the Lithuanian who epitomizes the country's commitment and insight to the cause of freedom in Belarus. Well, those days are still to come, but what we can do right now is give him this award. So I want to say Ačiū Linus, someone I'm proud to call a friend who I've known for 30 years. Thank you from me. Thank you from CEPA, the think tank, which I'm so proud to be part. Thank you, I think I can also say, on behalf of the millions of Belarusians who are risking jail, beatings, humiliation, torture, unemployment, and other things as they struggle for their freedom. Thank you for championing their cause. And thank you also on behalf of so many people in so many other countries for the leadership that you are showing on this issue, the eloquence, the effectiveness. We're proud that you've come to CEPA today. We're proud to give you this award. Thank you, Linus.
Needless to say, I'm humbled, grateful, proud to receive this award, and really grateful to CEPA, with whom we're cooperating for a long time. But it's extremely important that we are talking about freedom. For us, it's not just science fiction. For our nation, it's really something very tangible and clear. It's not a given coming out of the blue. It has price, and something should be defended every day. We really can enjoy being free, but we know that as we speak, many nations fighting for their freedom, for sovereignty, for independence, for territorial integrity, and this is something that should concern us, because we are building our relationship, our friendship on values, on very strong foundation, which really not just rhetoric, not just nice sound, it's something meaningful, important. I'm afraid that lately, when we are becoming sometimes too flexible or too pragmatic, sometimes values are sacrificed, and we are, well, fighting for interests which are taking over at the expense of values. It goes like cynic, so to say, tendency which should be avoided. And we, all politicians, in whatever rank, whatever positions, we have to take it very seriously. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm really grateful for our cooperation. I'm really proud to receive this award. And I believe we'll continue in the same spirit, all of us, all together, until our world will be whole, will be free, and definitely when freedom will win over all these evils, which are still quite widespread in the world, unfortunately. So thank you very much indeed, from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Minister Linkevičius. We are just so proud and delighted to work with you, to know you, and appreciate your leadership. And I'm sure that the people of Belarus really appreciate you being a champion for them, in solidarity to them. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the next section, which will be Spotlight on Democracy and Freedom. It is my honor to welcome Professor Timothy Garton Ash of Oxford University, Dr. Timothy Snyder of Yale University, and pro-democracy activist from Hong Kong, Nathan Law. For those of you that are following the discussion, please use hashtag CEPA Forum or go to cepaforum.org to watch the stream.
just when everything seems to be going so badly, we have Belarus, the most extraordinary example of persistent, peaceful, popular protest against a dictatorship. With colleagues at Oxford, I've surveyed the whole history of civil resistance from Gandhi to our own time, and I know of no other example of such a simple, clear confrontation between peaceful people power on the one side and the dictator with guns on the other. In fact, in the case of Lukashenko, quite literally carrying the Kalashnikov in his hand, behind him the army, the security forces, the police, the plainclothes thugs, well paid, apparently still loyal, but representing pure force. And against that, the extraordinary courage and endurance and creativity of the crowds coming out day after day despite brutal repression, the quite exceptional role played by women, making this a first in the history of civil resistance. Even the colors match. The women in white, the dictator and his goons in black. Now, I'm not saying that this foretells a happy end anytime soon. That is possible, but not at all likely, partly because there are none of those intermediating forces between the peacefully protesting people and the dictator with guns, which actually historically have led to a negotiated revolution, to a pacted transition. And also, of course, because we have no Gorbachev in the Kremlin, we have the anti-Gorbachev in Vladimir Putin. But I want to highlight Belarus for another larger reason. You've asked me to talk about the challenge before democracies and what's the most urgent thing we need to do. And I think one of our biggest problems is the problem of self-belief. If you go into a bookshop today and go to the politics section, you will find a whole series of titles such as The Light That Failed, The End of the Liberal Mind, The Twilight of Democracy, The End of Democracy, How Democracies Die. I think we're getting the message. All of them, by the way, excellent books. Apocalyptic titles help them to great sales on Amazon. All of them by authors supporting liberal democratic values, wanting to defend them by warning. But in this repetition of despair, of the end, the twilight, the death of democracy, there is a real danger that we spread a kind of cultural pessimism, even a historical fatalism about the future of democracy, as if we know the direction of history. In other words, the danger is that we make the same mistake that we made in the early 2000s, only the other way around. In the early 2000s, our mistake was to believe that we knew the direction of history and it was ineluctably towards the victory of democracy. Now we have the opposite danger, that we're thinking it leads ineluctably towards the victory of dictatorship. It is true that we in Western democracies have very serious problems, partly because of external forces, Russia, China, climate change, and so forth, partly because of our own failures over the last 30 years, which in the shortest summary could be expressed as neglecting the other half of our own societies. And we need to address those things. But our opponents, the democracies, the Belaruses, the Chinas, the Russias, even now the Turkeys, alas, have their own problems. And in the long term, those problems are even deeper, as I think we know from history. And one thing we do know from history, and which Belarus again tells us, is that people who live in unfreedom sooner or later get to yearn for freedom, and in the end, to stand up to try to achieve it. The Polish philosopher and great historian of Marxism, Leszek Kolakowski, had a favorite story about two little girls running through the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris. One of them was clearly ahead, but the other, the one who was behind, kept shouting, "I'm winning, I'm winning." And in the end, the little girl in front collapsed in tears, and the one behind did win. And I think there's a lesson in that for us, which is self-confidence, self-belief in our own values, in the power of freedom, is a really important part of freedom's power. Of course, we have to address the problems. We have to run fast again in the global ideological competition with the developmental authoritarianism of countries like China. But we also have to believe, and then we will win again.
History naturally is a conversation. So the problem for me is when regimes try to fix certain things in place, when regimes have an official interpretation which they say is history, or to put it a different way, when regimes deliberately confuse the convenient memory, the memory that's most convenient for them at the present moment, with a history that has to then somehow be obligatory for everyone in their country all the time. So to be clear, I don't have any problem with Russian historians or Polish historians or Hungarian historians having different attitudes about the past than I do. And there's nothing about the United States or about American historians which gives us the power to say this is history and everyone else is wrong. The real issue is when the political interests of a regime get in the way precisely of that historical conversation. So in transatlantic relations and in relations among NATO allies or in relations among European countries, probably the most important conversation is about the Second World War. Everyone thinks the Second World War is worth remembering. There's no controversy about that. The problem is that we all tend to remember it in a way which is a little bit self-serving. So Americans tend to forget that the war didn't start in December 1941. The British and the French tend to forget that they essentially abandoned their Polish ally in 1939. But when it comes to the Soviet Union, we have a particular problem, which is that in Soviet history, as in American history, the clock starts in 1941. But the difference is, and it's an important difference, that for the Soviet Union, the war didn't start even for the Soviet Union in June of 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked in Operation Barbarossa. The war began for the Soviet Union in September 1939, when the Soviet Union was an ally of Nazi Germany, when the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany together agreed to partition and invade Poland and much of the rest of Eastern Europe. Now, why is that so important and why is that so controversial? Well, the way that it's most obviously controversial is that when Russia today, like the Soviet Union before it, denies or displaces the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when Russia today, like the Soviet Union before it, denies that there was an alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, then we're placing the actual experiences of citizens of Poland and of the Baltic states in particular outside of the realm of reality. The past, the factual history of the past, the free interpretation of the past, open access to sources about the past, and an ongoing dialogue among historians and others about the past is something which we all need for democracy. And here Russia again is instructive. It's very hard to get local news in Russia. The collapse of regional television in Russia is, I think, an important step towards the emergence of the regime that we have in Russia. And that is part of a larger lesson about how democracy fails. It turns out that for democracy, people need to have access to factual reality where they live. You need factual reality where you live because you need to be able to cooperate with your neighbors. You need to be able to represent yourself when you're facing people who are, or institutions or companies that are stronger than you. There are many challenges facing democracy, but I actually think the production of facts, which means the active support morally, politically, and financially of local reporting is the thing that needs to take place in the United States and other threatened democracies. If we agree that democracies need access to facts, or that citizens of democracy need access to facts, there are a couple sides to the solution. The first side is the moral side. I think it's very important, and this is a line which, not incidentally, a number of very impressive Russian and also Polish and Czech and other dissidents took in late communism. It's very important to insist morally that truth is out there, that politics is, among many other things, that politics is about truth, that there is such a thing as truth, even though we never quite get there, that it's that pursuing the truth is dignified and productive and to be praised.
Hello everyone, I'm Nathan. Thank you for inviting me to speak here at the CEPA Forum. I'm an activist from Hong Kong and now flat and based in London. Life has been very turbulent for me. I was a student leader in the 2014 Umbrella movement and then elected in 2016 as the youngest lawmaker in Hong Kong's history and being expelled from the council by the Chinese Communist Party and jailed in 2017. Last September felt like a lifetime away. Back then I started graduate school at Yale in the US, but I was also constantly worried about my hometown. Hong Kong was not in a good shape. Ever since the anti-extradition protest started last June, we witnessed many episodes of unchecked police brutality. We got tear gassed every week. We saw how the police walk away as thugs beat up passers-by, journalists, and practically anyone in a subway station. We watched in horror as the police shot tear gas and rubber bullets at head level with no regard to irreplaceable injuries they inflicted. But even with all the frustration, anger, and disappointment at the government, Hong Kongers keep trying. We marched on the street in millions. When mass protests became illegal, we moved to shopping malls and even the airport to chant slogans and sing the protest anthem. As restrictions upon us grew stricter, Hong Kongers came up with new ways to protest. But Beijing kept quashing our civic society and our basic rights. As the world fought the coronavirus, Beijing pushed another draconian law to silence the hold of Hong Kong. The CCP bypassed Hong Kong's legislators to impose the so-called national security law. It completely destroys the freedom of expression of Hong Kong people. Anything, like chanting slogans or posting social media posts that is considered triggering hatred towards the government, could be illegal. The law allows Beijing to prosecute Hong Kong dissidents at their will and morph the whole legal system of Hong Kong into what China has right now, one that lacks judicial independence and fairness. It became clear that many of my actions, like testifying in a US Congress hearing and calling for sanctions for Hong Kong's officials who are responsible for human rights violations, would be illegal. In fact, the state media claimed that I am in a wanted list under the national security law now. If I were staying in Hong Kong under the law, I would face up to life imprisonment or even extradition to mainland China. It became clear to me that if I wanted to continue speaking out for Hong Kong and continue the international advocacy work that I'd been doing, I had to leave my hometown. For the time being, I have no way back. My example vividly demonstrates the dangers of authoritarianism, depriving people's rights, putting them in jail, tossing their mandate to their political representations into the rubbish bin. When individuals' freedom and rights are not protected, our society and our way of living could change very rapidly. Hong Kong is a salient example of how fast things could be deteriorated. Reporters are worried when they cover sensitive information, sensitive news. Professors are amending their research topics in order to escape from the red lines of the law. Self-censorship emerged after the implementation of the national security law. For those who are far away from Hong Kong and China, like Europe, Beijing uses its soft and sharp power, and often its capacity to invest or allow entry to its vast market to lure government to take its side. The 17+1 initiative China set up with Central and Eastern European countries is an obvious example. In return of such collaboration, we've seen governments toning down or even blocking statements condemning China's human rights violation. But Beijing's tactics is not limited to carrots. In its most recent trip, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi wanted that Czech Senate President would pay a heavy price for visiting Taiwan, and trigger an outcry from the European countries' leaders. In the very same trip, he effectively cautioned the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs that the two countries' ties would be strained again if China's core interests are not accommodated, just like what happened last time in 2010 when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo, a Chinese democratic activist who was jailed at the time. Beijing does not shy away from making threats. If you want to exercise your freedom to speak up your mind or do what you think is right. This is why anyone, any country that cares about freedom and democracy cannot look the other way when an authoritarian regime keeps threatening the democracies. Every time the free world let Beijing continue to its old ways, after some verbal condemnation is showing them that nothing will stop this expanding authoritarianism. Countries in the free world must act. It is now more important than ever to stand for our shared values of freedom and democracy. As you discuss how the new transatlantic decade should look like, I urge you to consider what policies can be put in place to signal our determination to protect these shared values. We need to build up a united front and coalition that holds China accountable. We do it assertively and multilaterally, with every democracy working together. Human rights clauses in trade deals, high scrutiny to Chinese international enterprises, sanctions on its corrupted officials, boycotting major events like 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics if they don't fix their gross human rights violation. These are the actions that we need to take. If we are unable to act, the situation of Hong Kong, the burden of our time, would be an example of how the world would end up and influenced by the authoritarian Chinese Communist Party. I hope you, whenever you're watching, can stand with us too, can walk with us and support our movement until the dawn arrives and the sunlight penetrates the heavy dark cloud above all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Garton-Ash, Dr. Snyder, Nathan, for these wonderful remarks to kick off our day. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, the director of our Democratic Resilience Program, Karina Rebezia.
I am Corina Rebezia, Director of the Democratic Resilience Program at CEPA. Multiple crises are currently challenging transatlantic democracies: democratic decline, public health and climate emergencies, and sharpened geopolitical competition. Domestic forces and malign state actors alike are taking advantage of this time of inflection to undermine democratic values, institutions, and mindsets. Russia and China in particular have used a wide set of tactics and tools of influence to reinforce a vicious circle of domestic and international authoritarianism and create a more favorable environment for their agenda. Left unaddressed, these challenges risk to undo the long-lasting transatlantic democratic consensus, the political relevance of our alliances, and the variability of democratic governments to perform their functions in the service of citizens. Democracies on both sides of the Atlantic need to have a comprehensive view of the nature of the authoritarian threat and the internal structural vulnerabilities that make us an easier target. Our mission at the Democratic Resilience Program is to develop strategies and policy solutions to build a whole-of-society approach to counter threats to democracy while investing in long-term resilience. We work with partners and allies in the transatlantic space to expose foreign disinformation from Russia and China, to raise awareness and enhance understanding around global challenges to democracies, and to promote regional voices and expertise in fighting common threats to democratic governance and rule of law. The values and principles underlying our alliance, transparency, accountability, and the rule of law, are essential to developing policy solutions to malign foreign influence while building democracy at home. Democratic resilience and whole-of-society responses have never been more critical, and we must invest in our common democratic future.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Glasser from The New Yorker, and I'm delighted to be moderating this morning's panel on resilience in the face of authoritarianism is our title, which means we can talk pretty much about anything, which is excellent because we have really a first-rate group of people with us joining us this morning. And I'd like to introduce our panelists. First of all, it's a distinguished group on both sides of the Atlantic, so we're really lucky to have them with us. First of all, we have joining us from Europe, we have the Vice President for Values and Transparency, which tells you a lot, I would say, already about the difference between Europe and the United States, because it's hard to imagine us having someone with such a job. But I would say to you, Vera Jourova, thank you so much for joining us, and we all probably also want to hear what your job description means, because it seems like we might need one of those.
Thank you.
Thank you much for being with us this morning. Next, we have Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island. He's a member of the Budget, the Environment and Public Works, the Finance, and relevant to this week in Washington, in particular, the Judiciary Committees. And he is a real activist on many of these issues. Senator, we're delighted that you could be with us this morning.
Good to be with you.
We won't grill you too much on current events, although maybe just a little bit. Thank you, sir. And after the senator, we have my friend Fiona Hill of the Brookings Institution. Fiona, of course, is now a household name, which is not necessarily a common thing in think tank land. But she has also worked on issues of Russia and Europe for decades. That's how we first met each other, when she was one of many fantastic tutors that I had in working as a Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post. So we're delighted that Fiona Hill is with us this morning.
Thanks,
and last but not least, of course, Carl Gershman, who is the president of the National Endowment for Democracy here in Washington. Carl, are you with us already, or are you just dialing in? Okay, Carl is on the line, I'm told. So that's great, because he's really, I think, a pillar of this conversation here in Washington. And so I think it's important that he be a part of this. So I think I'm going to start with everybody and start out actually by asking the question around the very framing of this. I'm really struck by the idea that there's been a pretty dramatic shift here in Washington, and I suspect in Brussels as well, over the very concept that autocracy and authoritarian challenges is something that is an external threat only. In the last few years, I think we in Washington have reevaluated that and come to think of our challenges as being internal as well as external, that we're no longer having a purely foreign policy conversation that is somehow divorced and separate from our own internal political conversations. And that I think Fiona and I can say represents a big change from the kind of discussion we were having about Russia or China 2 decades ago. So I guess let's go ahead and start with each of the panelists on that question. Maybe Fiona, actually, you can start us off with a few observations. How do we reconceive what it means to be facing threats to democracy today?
Well, I think, Susan, as you put it, it's a bit of a shock for many of us who have been studying, the rise of authoritarianism or, authoritarian states abroad, particularly in the old former Eastern Bloc, coming out of Soviet studies or China and communist China of the past. And I think what we're seeing here is one of our periodic crises, not just crisis, of democracy that we have ourselves in the West. If we think about the largest sweep of history, not just going back to the end of the Cold War, which we all seem to be preoccupied with at the moment, but going back much further, World War I, World War II, we've gone through these paroxysms many times before. We've had the rise of authoritarian leaders in many of the countries where we've taken democracy for granted. I mean, the World War II is just a case in point with the rise of Hitler and Mussolini in Germany and Italy, and Germany, which has been a paragon of democracy, since the end of World War II, but not without a great deal of effort. We had, an authoritarian imperial system in Japan. Japan, again, seen as a leading democracy. So, there are many instances, I don't want to keep going on, where, we've seen this in countries where we take democracy for granted. And even within our own systems, the United States has been challenged over again, and we're having, still the same challenges that we're grappling with race, the inability for full participation in government. I'm sure that Senator Whitehouse will have something to say about that. The United States is constantly trying to tackle these challenges. In many respects, as we're talking about now, the racial divisions we have in the United States are still the unfinished business from Reconstruction, which was an extraordinarily long time ago, after the end of the Civil War, and still the unfinished business from, times when we thought we'd settled a lot of this with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for example, 55 years ago. We're still in many respects a work in progress. And I think we can say the same thing, when we look at other countries in Western Europe, the United Kingdom, from where I, originate from. It had a lot of crises in its own democracy because of economic and social change in the 1970s, again in the 1980s. A lot of kind of questions about governance. And now we have the United Kingdom separating off from the European Union, I would say arguably because of crisis of faith in its own democracy at home, rather than in Brussels per se, even though there was a lot of discussion about the responsiveness of democracy within the European Union. And I'm sure that Vera Jurowicz can talk a great deal about, some of the concerns that the EU has about, as you said, Susan, backsliding among some of the European Union members. But actually what's interesting in the countries where we are seeing backsliding, and I'll use Poland and Hungary as examples here, they have also had periods, particularly between World War I and World War II, where they had quite reactionary governments. and some of the same problems that we're seeing today about the rise of nationalist parties, questions about what does democracy mean, the representation of the people, whether there should in fact be representative democracy or much more of a strong leader phenomenon. Those have been there in the past as well. So we often see these patterns repeating. So the message from my point of view is we can fix this. We actually have to have a constant renewal of our faith in democracy and a constant renewal of our institutions. It can't remain static.
Well, thank you, Fiona. I'm not sure if the history there is reassuring or unsettling, given what happened in between for Poland to change. In fact, Senator Whitehouse, I'd like to ask you, given this history that Fiona has just recounted for us, a lot of conversation right now in Washington about whether the United States is moving abruptly in a more authoritarian and less democratic small d direction. Do you share that concern? And do you see the conversation we're having today as primarily one about internal problems in the West, whether it be the EU or the United States, or do you see this primarily still in foreign policy terms?
I think the two are starting to overlap more and more, and there is an accelerating feedback loop between our behavior and the international power of reputation and principle that since World War II has created sort of an underlying tide that has flowed in America's favor. I'm the son, grandson, and nephew of Foreign Service officers. I grew up in that world. We had kind of a term called, tweak the eagle's beak, when countries would push back on stuff the US was doing. But the underlying tide was one of confidence in America, trust in America, satisfaction, happiness that America was there to be a voice for principle and for good in the world. And even if they had to tweak our beak sometimes, they were damn glad that we were there. And our internal behavior is starting to undercut that power of reputation and principle, and that's how the two overlap. There are also some specific ways that we can get into later in the conversation in which we are undermining our credibility and empowering our adversaries in this contest for democracy.
Vice President Jourova, you've heard a lot, I'm sure, these last few years from Washington about our own internal struggles. Tell us about Europe's struggles and how relevant they are to the question of internal threats to democracy versus external.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Thank you for invitation also. And thank you for giving me a chance to share the view that we have very similar struggles with the United States. So whenever I come to Washington, I hear from the friends, from different partners that we really would try to find common solutions on very similar problems, including how to deal with, for instance, illegal content online and how to deal with the foreign pressures through disinformation and so on. I am not an analyst. I am a politician. And as you said, Susan, my portfolio is values and transparency. So I sometimes have a feeling that my job description is to save Europe, but I have many good colleagues to help. But on values, and transparent and democracy. European Union consists of 27 member states with different traditions and different historical experience. In some states, we have already since the First World War, very, very steady, of course, interrupted by the Second World War, but steady and permanent development of democratic societies. In the Central and Eastern Europe, we have a different story, 30 years of democracy, so still quite fresh, and more under the pressure from Russia, trying to renew the sentiments that in the past, the life was easier, the life was more settled, that in the past we understood better what's going on, because indeed this era we live through is full of uncertainties, full of destabilization, and it is a real stress test for our democracies, but not only for the young ones, also for the old ones. Everywhere in Europe, we see the rise of populism and nationalism. And Fiona, you spoke about we should defend, we should do more, but who are we? When I say we, I mean mainly the citizens to be with us who try to keep democracy and fundamental rights and rule of law functioning. In different member states, between 30–40% of citizens believe that democracy delivers stability and prosperity and fairness for all. Yeah? I'm not speaking about COVID-19, which is, of course, amplifying now all the negative feelings we already had before. So for me, it's important to come with the policies for the EU, which will guarantee that the citizens will increase their trust to institutions and in democracy, and will always, in every member state, at every moment, a chance to express their political will through free elections. This is the core thing. That's why now we take measures. We are going to adopt the European Democracy Action Plan, which is focusing on protection of elections, protection of freedom of speech and independent and pluralistic media. We are covering also the issue of disinformation, because the elections should not be the competition of dirty methods like Cambridge Analytica, if you remember, and dirty money coming also from outside. But it should be a competition of real people, real visions, political campaigning, which is transparent, which we understand who is financing that, and so on. So this is the core thing we are now working on. And if you want to know the details, I can share with you how we work, for instance, with the American big tech, and it helps. That American big tech, because anytime I speak to the managers, yesterday I spoke to Mr. Dorsey, the owner of Twitter, I always have a feeling that we do not have to explain to each other what are the basic values and basic principles. So it makes the cooperation much more easier. Last comment or two comments. We have recently published a report where we openly speak about the coordinated and intentional continuous attacking through disinformation from the side of China and Russia. So it is the first time we were that clear, and it was high time to do that. And also we are more and more clear that disinformation and dangerous coordinated attacks must not change our history. And it was the case of Brexit. We have to take a lesson, because Brexit campaign was full of disinformation. We didn't pay enough attention to that. And that's why we now try to come with the concept which will take this lesson, which will improve the working with information online. We want to work more with the fact checkers, and we do not want to remove content. We are not introducing censorship, but we want to focus on fact checking, on public reports for the people to know who is manipulating them. And we want these reports from Facebook, Google, and several others. And we need to increase the resilience of the people to be able to think over when they are under the attack. I'm sorry I was too long, but I just wanted to share with you what is the European way and what I have on my table now.
Well, thank you very much, Vice President, because I think that you have introduced a lot of important themes for the conversation, in particular, the question of disinformation and the role of external actors such as Russia and China. Carl, you have been in this position for a long time to see the arc of this discussion. Do you believe that disinformation is an external threat at this point? What do we do when the problem is coming from inside the house, if you will? And how much have you seen your own thinking evolve toward how the US and the West should deal with threats to democracy, say, over the last 4 years? You know, is your view today what it was 4 years ago, Carl? All right, we don't have Carl. So actually, Senator Whitehouse, I'm gonna go ahead and ask.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Oh, you're here. Okay, great.
Yeah, I had to unmute. Thank you very much. I'm much more worried today than I was 4 years ago. You know, the polarization in our country, our inability to have a common national identity, the absence of an agreed upon version of what constitutes truth are all factors which make it very difficult, not only for the United States to lead in the world, but also to govern itself effectively. And so we're in a crisis such as one that I haven't seen in the entire time that the National Endowment for Democracy has been in existence. And on top of this, we do have what you suggest, which is a growing interference from outside. It's from Russia, but it's also from China. It's from Iran. Russia's information warfare, China's sharp power, its United Front influence operations. This has, what this demonstrates, I think, is that we have to recognize that we're in a new period where the battle over ideas, the battle over values has become now the new terrain of strategic competition in the world. So this is, extremely serious. And then, of course, it's been exacerbated enormously by COVID and the ability of authoritarian countries to exploit COVID to try to tighten their controls, to try to show the superiority of a highly centralized system like China to a democratic model. So, and you have on top of that, which enables the foreign competition, you have the rise of social media, which has contributed enormously to the breakdown of social unity. There's no longer any common news source. There are many different news sources, and they're all equally true. It's a kind of a babble that is driving political decision making in the world today, and it's very dangerous. Having said all that, and I realize it's a very difficult, dangerous period, I just want to call attention to one very positive development, which the uprising in Belarus, I think, is a remarkable development. It shows that people at the grassroots, and it's not just Belarus, we see this in Sudan and many other countries in the world today. And in a part, this is because of the expansion of communications technology. Consciousness has increased, people are demanding their rights. And in the case of Belarus, I think they have an entirely new national identity. And if they can achieve their goals, and I believe they will achieve their goals because Lukashenko has lost legitimacy, and I don't think there's anything that Russia can do to restore it. If they achieve their goals, I think it will, inspire people, give a lesson in freedom and courage. And I think this is an extremely high priority today to do what we can to enable the people of Belarus to realize their desire for freedom and for a new national identity. And this, of course, is something where the United States and Europe can work closely together, and where Europe has the ability, and I know it's looking at this right now, Europe has the ability through its sanctions policy. I know they're considering sanctioning Lukashenko, which I think is important. This would, be a way, I think, to begin to reverse the downward momentum.
So, Carl, that's great. I'm glad you brought up Belarus. Fiona and Senator Whitehouse, I want to ask both of you, why have we not heard more in Washington about this uprising in Belarus? First of all, what does it tell us about the state of U.S. policy toward Russia and toward Eastern Europe right now, Fiona. And, especially I should note for those who are, tuning in from Europe, you might not be aware of this. We actually now have a situation where some of the president's allies are speaking publicly about the idea that opposition to President Trump here in the United States is tantamount to a color revolution. This is something we didn't see even 4 years ago, the adoption of rhetoric that seems to echo that of President Putin. We have also, I'll throw in there to both of you the question of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, which is obviously a serious crisis. It appears to be the use of a banned chemical substance that's only under the control of the Russian government. And yet, not only have we heard little about that in Washington, but just the other day, the president said he wasn't ready to talk about it and certainly wasn't going to blame Russia for it. So Fiona, how do we make sense of all that? How can we talk about Belarus when we can't talk about Russia?
Well, I think you actually just answered the question yourself there, Susan, which obviously you're an excellent analyst of the situation, by pointing out to the commentary here in the United States. Because I think just as Carl has said there, and as Sheldon also said, our own domestic problems are undermining our ability to lead on a whole host of questions. And if the United States is frankly having the same debates as other countries in crisis, like Belarus, about its democracy and about a certain entitlement to lead, that there's only one person who matters at the top, which is something that we kind of keep hearing. The extreme version of the executive branch as one executive, as one president, if we're fetishizing the presidency in the way that some actors are in our own politics, we're putting ourselves in exactly that same situation. Because what is the fight about in Belarus? As Carl says, it's really about this grassroots upswelling of people who want to express their own freedoms. And that freedom is not really abstract. It's the freedom to choose a leader in a free and fair election. It's the freedom to assemble. It's the freedom to have a voice and to have a representation of that voice at the highest levels. And, what we've seen, here in the United States is actually a debate, and not just, people around the president, but in larger swathes of society about whether those freedoms should still be applied to everyone here in the United States. I mean, I've been deeply disturbed, as all of us have, about this division that we have, where we're dividing ourselves not as red, white, and blue Americans, but as red Americans and blue Americans. I personally don't know what that means. It's a kind of, we're somehow alienating, parts of our body politic from each other. And we're also, in a situation right now, when I said about fetishizing the presidency, that the idea that only one person in our system matters when 330 million of us all matter. And that is the whole fundament of US democracy. It's the institutions, it's the representational part of our democracy. It's why we have people like Senator, White House. We don't just have one person. And Belarus is all about whether Belarusians for the future in the 21st century should have one person who just decides that they can stay in power indefinitely, or whether they might have more choice. And this is where Russia comes in as well, because, of course, what's happening in Belarus is deeply disturbing to Vladimir Putin, who has just pushed through constitutional amendments through a referendum held in the midst of COVID, where, interestingly, Putin did everything he could and the Kremlin did to get everybody out to vote in this referendum, extending the process, mail-in ballots, in-process ballots, all kinds of new mechanisms to get people out to vote for his right to basically push through term limits and to potentially stay in power till 2036. And our own president is now talking about a redo, a third term. And, obviously that has to be put to a constitutional discovery, just loose talk about being entitled to stay endlessly in power. This is the essence of the problem that we're dealing with. While the United States is treading down this authoritarian handbook, a textbook case of the kinds of things we've seen in other places, we cannot stand up and talk in any kind of cogent fashion about our concerns about what's happening in Russia, or about how we could help Belarusians at the grassroots level have the right to assemble and to protest, especially if we're also trying to send out all kinds of federal forces to suppress protests in our own cities and penalizing cities for actually having protests. We're now in that same space, and we cannot lead others to push back against it.
Senator Whitehouse, just last week, the director of the FBI testified and said that, in fact, the U.S. election system was once again under attack, in effect, from Russia and other actors, but primarily in a more active way by Russia. The President of the United States said he disagreed with that. There doesn't seem to be anything that the Senate is willing to do about it. Is this a change?
Well, there was a pretty strong bipartisan intelligence committee report that confirmed this. We've had briefings out of which people have come and reported that this is in fact true and ongoing. So obviously the Trump administration doesn't want to talk about this because whatever the peculiarity is between Putin and Trump prevents the administration from robustly engaging in this area. And secondarily, the manner, the means through which a lot of that Russian disinformation gets propagated into this country is the same manner and means through which other domestic disinformation gets propagated into this country. So if you want to clean up dark money and identify who the real principals are behind an advertisement or behind a political expenditure of some kind, which is a good way to keep Putin out of our politics, you can identify it. You then run afoul of the fossil fuel industry, which very much wants to have these anonymized channels of influence that they can run their covert operation of climate denial through. So it's really hard when we have domestic interests that are keeping the channels for foreign interference open to then figure out how we fight that foreign interference, particularly if rhetorically the administration is unwilling to go there. We're unwilling to solve the problem as a matter of kind of the technical process of how it works because of primarily the fossil fuel industry, and we're unwilling to have the rhetorical confrontation because it puts Trump on the wrong side of it.
That's a really interesting insight, especially as Vice President Jourova is also speaking about the question of how you would engage on disinformation campaigns from the point of view of a legislator or politics. Just quickly, what do you think our Russia policy is right now? And are there actors who matter beside the president himself? We've heard for 4 years, that while Republicans have a very strong consensus, even with many Democrats on this, but I guess I would ask you, does that matter if it's contradicted, that policy toward Russia from the very top, or do you think it's useful?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to tell what our Russia policy is because of so many cacophonic voices that are going in different directions on this. Obviously, the person with the biggest Twitter following and the loudest megaphone on all of this is the president, and he's usually saying things that are opposite to what is true and what is happening. So that creates a very discordant and weak position for our country.
So, Vice President Jourova, you just met the other day, I believe, with the leader of the Belarusian opposition, who is now, she's now in exile, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. What is your view, first of all, about, do you agree with Carl about the likelihood of success for this extraordinary Belarusian uprising? And second of all, what kind of support, if any, should they expect from the European Union and the United States? Will you be able to act together with Washington, given how divided Washington is?
I think this is one of the issues or moments when we should clearly be united, because this is about fight for democracy and desire for freedom in Belarus. And indeed, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, she was sitting on this very chair. I was sitting in front of her. It was a very impressive moment for me to have a chance to speak to her. It was not for the first time. And her message was very clear. We need the support of international community. We need the support of the leaders of democratic world. But it's for Belarusian people to accomplish the fight There has to be a combination of different measures taken from outside, which can help, which will not do some harm in Belarus. And the combination which I see is the statements, they are words, but they are important. And also Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, gave a very clear statement in her speech last week that we stand behind the people of Belarus and in their fight for freedom. The second thing, we are now in the process of deciding whether to introduce or upgrade the sanctions against concrete people in Belarus. Unfortunately, on Monday, the ministers of foreign affairs didn't come to an agreement. We need unanimity for that. And it was blocked by Cyprus. But we have to continue, and we have to upgrade the sanctions list, which the people will understand. So the key people who are representing repressive regime have to be on this list. So I think that we have to send the signal, and we have to send the money. And this is what we are doing. We are supporting Belarus by financial support. We are now sending 50 million euro to the civil society organizations, not to the government, but we want to support also Belarusian people's fight against COVID. So these are the possibilities we have, and we are going to use them in full.
So can I ask you?
Can I add one more thing? Yeah. The bridge between what we spoke about before, that the democracy is taken for granted. Well, when I watch the streets of Minsk, full of mainly courageous women, and the revolution in Belarus has women's face. It's also a very interesting and striking fact. This is the reminder for all who take democracy for granted, because their people are struggling to get a democratic regime and to acquire the freedoms and possibility to decide the future of their country. So there is a very big symbolic importance in also for Europe in what's happening in Belarus.
So I think we can all agree on that. Let me just ask you quickly: do you believe that the possibility of Russian intervention to save President Lukashenko, is that still something that could happen?
I do believe that President Putin will use different ways how to support Mr. Lukashenko, but I want to be optimistic here, and I cannot see the force which will stop the revolution. I share the view with Mr. Gershman that they will be successful.
Carl, you've introduced this excellent feeling of optimism, which is not one I have to say that I've been used to really all that much in the last few years when it comes to discussions about Russia or Belarus, for that matter. We haven't talked at all today about a different country, about China, and the challenge to the United States and to Europe that its model of techno-authoritarianism, if you will, poses. How do you assess that challenge versus that posed by Russia? Often you hear them sort of mentioned as an equivalency. What is your view about that?
Well, Susan, the difference is that Russia is a declining power. Putin knows that. He knows he's even faced with an existential threat in Belarus. He also knows, I think, that he can't intervene because there'd be the same kind of backlash that you have in Ukraine. And he doesn't like Lukashenko anyway. So, but China is a power on the rise. And, it was 15 years ago that Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel laureate, who was not, died in prison and could not accept his Nobel Peace Prize, he warned in an essay in 2006 that if China continued to rise as a dictatorship, it would pose a threat to democracy all over the world. And I think we're, especially under Xi Jinping now, we're seeing that entirely coming true. We see the threat from China on so many different levels. It's not only its diplomatic aggressiveness, its military aggressiveness in the South China Sea, on the border between India and China, its disinformation activities, but especially in human rights. I mean, I think we have to realize that today, as we speak, China is engaged in what under international law is considered to be a policy of genocide against the Uyghur people in East Turkestan or Xinjiang, whatever you call it. Just yesterday, I got a report, it was in Reuters actually, that they are now subjecting to forced labor 500,000 people in Tibet. They're doing the same thing in Tibet. And we see what's happening in Hong Kong and on the mainland. And what China is doing in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs is that they are actually perfecting the surveillance state in these countries so that it can be used in other countries, which then they do export through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a policy that is funded with $1 trillion, 7 times the size of our Marshall Plan in real dollars, to expand their influence. And they do have a global vision. And one final point is that they are actually trying to change international norms in the international system. As we withdraw from the international system, they are moving in on it to change norms so that universal values no longer have any meaning, and values of sovereignty and centralized power are all that matters. We have a gigantic problem on our hands. This is actually a much more serious, I think, a more serious problem than Russia, which as I say, not only do I think it's declining, but I think if the Belarus struggle can succeed, the next stage in what you might call the revolutions of 1989 to 1991, I think is going to come about with the struggle in Russia, which has already begun in the Far East. But China is a much, much more serious problem, and we're going to have to begin to focus on that like a laser beam.
Senator Whitehouse, it's often said in Washington today that there is essentially more bipartisan consensus now around China than there used to be, in the sense that the old consensus about engaging with China has essentially unraveled, and that even Democrats are in a very different place today. Does that offer you more opportunity to work with Republican colleagues on measures that might address the threats posed by China, or do you see different ways of analyzing the problem coming up? And also, do you agree with Carl's assessment that essentially the bigger long-term challenge to the United States is this model of authoritarianism that's being perfected by China and might soon be ripe for export?
So on bipartisanship, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think two of the issues that lend themselves to strong bipartisan action are the industrial espionage that China has long engaged in. We were very touchy about pushing on the Chinese on their industrial espionage program against our companies, because the companies would scream that we had to be nice to the Chinese or the Chinese would put pressure on them. But ultimately, the Obama administration finally did the criminal case against some of the PLA officers, and Trump has continued that. I think this question of deliberate government-sanctioned industrial espionage against our companies to provide Chinese companies with cheap, technology that they didn't lease but instead stole has strong bipartisan appeal. The other area that's emerging as I think, real national security area is the Chinese fishing presence around the world, stripping countries that depend on their fisheries of those fisheries, behaving very aggressively in even national waters of other countries, sending Chinese military vessels to physically defend illegal fishing fleets and vessels from China. So I think there's some real opportunities there. As to what the big threat is, maybe it's because I'm in Congress, but I think, frankly, our biggest threat right now is to ourselves. And that if you see us, as we've described today, in a fundamental conflict between rule of law world and kleptocracy and corruption world, that the forces within our rule of law world that are aiding and abetting the forces of corruption and kleptocracy have got to be cleaned up. A, because it foments their power on the other side, but B, because it does us immense reputational harm. We are probably the top sanctuary for dirty money in the world right now. That's got to stop. We can't be a city on a hill and be the place where when you've looted your country so it has no hospitals, no roads, no health care, no justice, we're the place where all the money goes. That's not a good look for a city on a hill. And ditto when around the world, poorer people start to really take climate change punches in the face. We're just seeing the leading edge of the storm right now. When that storm is really on us, people are going to want to know what happened here. And why did this vaunted democracy, the United States of America, stop all climate action for a decade? And when they look into it, they'll see a lot of fossil fuel dark money. They'll see the same techniques that the Russians are using in Belarus and other places, used by our own fossil fuel industry against us. Those are terrible stories for our democracy and for our reputation. And it's not just important to clean them up for domestic purposes, it's important to clean them up for our national standing and for the, I hate the term, but people call it soft power, but the power of principle and reputation that has long driven the tide of destiny in America's direction.
And just give us a quick update on where that stands in terms of you have worked to advance a specific kleptocracy initiative in the Senate.
Well, we're working on getting it into the National Defense Authorization Bill right now. That won't pass until after the election. We'll see where it goes. It has bipartisan support. Much of the ginned up opposition from groups driven largely by the people who profit off this foul behavior has evaporated. The American Bar Association has backed off. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has backed off. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, for some reason, is still engaged against the bill. I'd love to see how they're being funded in that effort. But I do think we're going to get it. I mean, you've got people like David Petraeus on the conservative side of the equation writing op-eds with people like me, pretty powerful progressives, saying we got to deal with this together. We've got Lindsey Graham and Mike Crapo and others ardently pursuing this. Chuck Grassley is my co-sponsor on it, along with Democrats. So I hope, what do they say? There's always room for the slip between cup and lip. But at the moment, it looks like we should get this done in the NDAA to a very significant step, at least getting this information to FinCEN.
That's interesting. It sounds like you need to have a conversation with Vice President Jourova as well, who seems to have similar ideas for how the EU should proceed.
It should be a common cause for all rule of world countries to clean up the kleptocracy problem and to deal with climate change and out the fossil fuel industry political mischief that is behind the climate denial and obstruction.
Mm-hmm. So, Vice President Jourova, can I set you up with Senator Whitehouse to work on a transatlantic on this?
Well, after the decades of us trying to export our model of democracy and fundamental rights, we suddenly see that there is a push from China towards the West to import here their model of governance and their practices of surveillance. So in other words, the technologies which might be the back door, we have to do everything not to let China to get the technological supremacy over the world. That's why we are investing now in having better protection in 5G world, or also in artificial intelligence world. We have taken very serious the notion that through artificial intelligence technologies there could be very dangerous ways used against the people. So we are very vigilant on China. We have upgraded our strategy. where we say in some things China is the partner for cooperation. This is very narrow now. In some things they are competitors, but we have very important spheres where they are clear rivals. And these are especially these technological threats and some other issues. So we are reflecting on the fact, which was described by Karl Gershman, that China has the global vision, and that they are moving towards the global player, and we have no other chance than to react on that. And I think that here our ties with the United States are very important. I think that we should renew or resume our serious debate about these matters, including human-centric technologies after the elections in the United States, when the situation will be stabilized.
Well, that's a good and optimistic notion that the situation will be stabilized in the United States after the elections, as opposed to further destabilization.
We wish you so.
Well, in fact, actually, that goes to my next question, which might take us through the end of our time, which is, we don't know what's going to happen here in the U.S. in November, but let's indulge at least in the thought exercise that there is an opportunity after the election to take more concrete action and to work on some of these problems. I want to ask each of you, what would be one thing that you would say to the next US president in terms of one very specific concrete action that we're not doing right now, that we should be doing to address challenges to the democracy, whether it's Russia or China or not? I mean, it does feel that in the last 4 years, we've had a lot of conversation around this in the US, but it feels kind of circular at this point. So Fiona, I guess I'd ask you, you had your shot on the inside, you're now back on the outside. If you could get anything through right now, what would be the one thing that you think we could do that would really matter that we're not doing right now?
Well, there are actually two things that I'd like to say. One is that we need to go out and vote because the biggest thing that anybody can do individually, we all have individual agency in this matter. And, we see Belarusians wanting to have their vote counted. Well, our votes will be counted, but they only counted if you go out and vote. So I think the number one thing that I would want to say, obviously people participating in the CEPA panel from the United States are most likely to vote, I would imagine, but they should go out there and get out the vote, because it's very difficult for anyone, both a domestic and a foreign actor, to manipulate on the margins if there is a massive turnout. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I just want to applaud Senator Whitehouse, because this is exactly what we need to do. We need to clean up our act at home. We need to get rid of the crony, corrupt, kleptocracy that we've started to create, and that's all part of this sense of people feeling entitled, either to the presidency or to political office. And we need to get back to shoring up our own institutions by everybody demanding that we clean up our act. So, more regulation, sensible regulation of social media. More efforts, as Senator Whitehouse has said, just exactly along the lines that he laid out, of bipartisan action to stop people from enriching themselves from their public service, and to benefit from essentially laundering dirty money, both from domestic and international sources. Somehow we need to get, I would say, the Supreme Court, by whatever mechanisms we can do that again, to reconsider this issue of money in politics. So it's cleaning up our own act at home. And I just wanted to applaud Senator Whitehouse when he was speaking and making it bipartisan.
Fiona, thank you for that. I want to get to the others, but just quickly, because you spent so long thinking about Russia, just the quick, 2-sentence answer. Do you share Karl's optimism when it comes to the outcome of this uprising in Belarus? And also, he expressed in sort of we could have a whole separate panel on his view that Russia might be in the incipient early phases of essentially the crumbling of sort of Putinism.
Well, I think that this is exactly getting back to your question before about Navalny, which, I didn't answer at the time. I mean, I think Navalny has been poisoned, kind of perhaps not to kill him, but to put him out of action, get him out of the country, precisely because there was that fear on the part of the Russians of exactly as Carl said, what's happening in the Russian Far East in Khabarovsk, getting picked up in Siberia, where there's always been that kind of same, let's just say, urge to freedom, out of sight and out of mind of Moscow. And that, in fact, people would be inspired by what's happening on the ground in Belarus, because nobody wants to have the same leader indefinitely. Contrary to some of the fantasies that we're sort of seeing in our own kind of political system, term limits and, going back to that on all kinds of institutional levels would be a good effort as well, to remind people that these are not life sinecures. We're having discussions about this in every front right now. But, when people like Putin can think that they can stay in power indefinitely and that, they can just usurp the voice of the people, this is when the problem is. And I think Carl was absolutely right that, Belarusians of all people, is even, kind of some prominent Belarusians are saying they were surprised that the Belarusian people would also want to take to the streets and call for their rights. This is a very strong sign. And I think, the protests that we see in US streets, the upsurge of people behind Black Lives Matter, it shows that people do want change. And we want to have our leadership to be responsive to that change. And that is indeed, where I do share Carl's optimism that over the, the fullness of time, we will see people taking matters into their own hand, because every individual matters, not just one person at the top.
Senator Whitehouse, I'll give you a shot. Let's stipulate that your bill passes. But if you could advise a putative President Biden, what's the first thing he should be doing that we're not doing right now to address some of these issues?
I would suggest, because our values are not just our values, they're also a strategic asset for us, that we have to start living them and propagating them. And so I would recommend that a President Biden ask America to lead an international convention on kleptocracy, corruption, and transparency, and make it a global effort by rule of law world to rid ourselves of the dark economy that supports international criminals of the worst kind, international kleptocrats of the worst kind, and corruption globally.
Carl, you've been working on these issues for so many years. If you had one shot at it, what would you say in January 20th we should be doing?
The most important thing is a problem referred to earlier. We have to bring our country back together again. I agree completely with Senator Whitehead. When I was talking about China being a more serious problem than Russia, I wasn't saying that we were the most serious problem, because unless the United States can reunify, unless we can come back together around values, it's going to be very hard to solve all these other problems. This is the most critical thing. And when Fiona was talking about, the Russian Far East, she reminded me that during the protests in Minsk and other Belarusian cities before the August 9th election, there were parallel protests taking place in Khabarovsk. And the slogan being shouted by the people in Khabarovsk was, "We have the same values. We have the same values." Now, people all over the world are now speaking for these values. The young people in Hong Kong, and everywhere, I think people have these values. The U.S. has to speak for these values and then to base our national identity on these values, because this is what's in the Declaration of Independence. This is what inspired Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. This is what we have to, this is what we are, and this is what we have to stand for. And I think this is also what's happening in the world. A concluding thought is, when I look at the world, I see what's happening in Belarus and in Sudan and in Thailand and in Hong Kong and so forth. These are people who are fighting for the values that we represent in the world, or should represent in the world. And I think that should be a source of inspiration. We could be at a turning point right now. A crisis is an opportunity. We're in a deep crisis right now. It could be an opportunity, and we have the opportunity to come back, and we need to do that.
Vice President Jourova, we literally have like 1 minute left, but I want to give you the last word. Vice President Biden has said that if he is elected, he wants the U.S. to come back to the head of the table. Is he welcome there from Europe?
Well, we welcome everybody who is with us on the same side of the values we speak about here today. And we should join forces because what is so uncomfortable for the autocrats, we should promote and support. And these are the values we speak about. It's active citizens, free media, independent justice, many other factors which are now under pressure also in Europe. So I think that we know what we want. We know what we don't want. The people are calling for the values everywhere. On many places. So I think that who, if not us, Europe and United States, should say, yes, these are the values we support and we will help also those who need it.
Well, I want to thank everyone for a fantastic and surprisingly optimistic conversation, considering that the subject was the internal crisis that we face as well as external ones. I somehow found it to be a very optimistic, forward-looking, and even practical discussion. So I want to thank all of you for this and for joining this CEPA conference this year. And we'll turn it back over to our hosts. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And thank you so much to our distinguished panelists and to Susan for moderating that exhilarating conversation. And you're absolutely right. I am optimistic after hearing that conversation. And I hope you all are too, as you're tuning in to these discussions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the next session, Spotlight Discussion on Foreign Influence in Europe, with Washington Post columnist George Will and the mayor of Prague, Mayor Hryb.
George Will, talking from Washington today, and I'm talking with Mayor Hryb of Prague. He is a man of many interests and much influence, who has made some waves where waves ought to be made about relations with Russia, about relations with China, and about the fate of liberal democracy. I stress the adjective and the noun, liberal democracy in Europe. And the European Union's obligation to promote liberal democracy. So in our conversation today, I want to touch on a lot of those subjects, beginning with the relationship that the mayor has with Taiwan. Let's go back to the question of when China threatened to did cancel, I guess, some appearances by some musicians. Why did they do that, and what was your response?
Well, the story is quite long in this case. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this interview. And yes, we had a long history with Beijing. In fact, we do not have direct contact with China as a country, but as a city, we had a partnership agreement or sister cities agreement between Prague and Beijing. And this agreement has been signed in 2016. And there was a lot of criticism already at that time. For example, all the parties who are now in charge of the power in Prague had criticized that at that time. So it should be not a surprise that as soon as we got to the city hall and that we tried to negotiate this, because the main problem was this article number 3, which talked about the one China policy. And such an Article number 3 has no place, in fact, in the sister cities agreement or partnership agreements in general between the cities, because it's simply a matter of national politics. So therefore, we wanted to renegotiate that. However, the Beijing side didn't share our view on the situation, and they simply didn't want to leave it out. So they started to bully our orchestras, well, not our orchestras, but orchestras who had Prague in the name. And later, when we pointed out that nor London nor Riga has got this Article number 3 included in their partnership agreements between the city and Beijing, they started to ignore us.
Then what happened? I want to get to the flag of Tibet flying over City Hall. What happened?
Yeah, well, about the Tibetan flag, the fact is that we merely restored the tradition that was here before us, because our predecessor, our direct predecessor, sort of interrupted the tradition, and that was the flying the Tibetan flag as in the memory of the Tibetan uprising. And this is a tradition that is widespread across the Czech Republic. A lot of city halls in towns or even small villages are flying the Tibetan flag in the memory of this event. And I believe there is a sort of empathy from the side of the Czech citizens towards the people of Tibet, because we had also some problems with our cultural self-determination during our history, and therefore we feel sympathy for the people of Tibet who have the very same problem. However, I have to say that I have received also a letter from Dalai Lama, and His Holiness wrote me that in fact I should have no problems with China regarding flying the Tibetan flag, because he personally spoke about that with the Chairman Mao at his time, and the Chairman Mao asked that if they have the Tibetan flag, and Dalai Lama said yes, and the Chairman Mao said that they should fly their flag along with the Chinese flag. So Dalai Lama wrote me that actually they have the permission directly from Chairman Mao to fly the Tibetan flag, so there should be really no problem with that.
At long last, one of the thoughts of Chairman Mao that civilized people can agree with. We know without question that murder is an instrument of Vladimir Putin's domestic power preservation and of his foreign policy. You've had the experience of, in April, of a Russian diplomat being expelled on a matter of murder. Could you tell us about that?
Well, yes, there was this alleged plot. I had a police protection for several weeks, and I was not alone in this. Actually, there were other district mayors who had also the police protection, and this was due to the possible threat from the Russian embassy. And it actually the main problem, or the supposed reason why the Russian embassy was angry on us, was the fact that we interpreted the history in the way it really happened. And this was a different way than the Russians interpret the history. And it was also a different way than the Russian history, or the history was interpreted during the communist era. For example, it's a well-known historical fact that the Russians actually started the Second World War together with the Nazis, because they militarily invaded Poland, each one from other side. And however, this is something that the Russians do not like to hear, the fact that they were actually at the beginning of this war. And they also do not like to hear the fact that the Prague liberated itself through the Prague uprising, and then that the Russians actually, when they came to Prague, they came to an already liberated city, because the Nazis surrendered day before they came. And this is, in fact, just a matter of facts, pure historical facts, because you've got the signed treaty documents and so on, but it is completely against the main historical topic of the Russians' narrative, and that is that they had liberated the whole Europe and they freed the Europe from Nazism. However, that is, although the fact is that they, of course, had played their part during the liberation of Europe, well, first of all, they were taking part also in starting the war. And the second thing is that they actually didn't brought us freedom, because they very soon started to behave as merely a conqueror, not a liberator. So they, for example, they kidnapped a lot of Czech citizens with Russian origins and they dragged them to Russia, and they put them into gulags, or they tortured and killed them right in Prague. So that's the things that they do not like to hear very much.
Yes, I'm sure as you recall, in George Orwell's 1984, the slogan of the party, the Big Brother's party that governs Oceania, is "He who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past." So history has become an arena of contention, I know. Something has happened since 1989 that is discouraging to many of us. In 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. Shortly thereafter, the Warsaw Pact disappears, Soviet Union disappears, and it was thought to be a sunrise of liberal democracy. Democracy being government by consent, the liberal component of it being the protection of minority rights and restraints on state power. Today, there are, within the European Union, in Hungary and in Poland, governments that are more or less proudly and explicitly illiberal. Mr. Orban in Hungary says proudly that he is conducting an illiberal democracy. How big a problem is this? And that in the 21st century, we have governments like this in the center of Europe. And what can and should the European Union do about this facet of what Larry Diamond, an American scholar, has called the democratic recession that's occurred since early in this century?
Well, it is very, very obvious that the things that are happening, not just in Hungary, but also in Poland, are really, in some ways, makes reminiscence of some past times. And well, the situation seemed to be getting better in Slovakia, for example. However, we will see how this will evolve, because right now there was this court proceeding with the murders and the people who ordered the murder of the journalists and his fiancée, Jan Kuciak. And this is the things that show us that the democracy in those countries is really being threatened by many things either it's the mafia, the organized crime, or sort of clero-fascist tendencies, or other things. So we had made a pact of free cities together with other V4 mayors, V4 capital mayors. That means the capital city Warsaw, the capital city Budapest, and the capital city Bratislava, together with Prague. We have made this pact of free cities, and although the COVID-19 had interrupted our effort, I think that we will get back to it very, very soon. Unfortunately, you could see a fine example of the problem during the recent election of president in Poland, because one of the candidates who made it into the final round with the former and current president was actually the mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski. And if you look at the campaign, for example, the role of the so-called public, but it's merely a state-owned media in Poland, you could see that the problem is getting bigger and bigger. And the result is the fact that there was only a very, very minimal difference in the amount of the votes for the candidates. And maybe if this media manipulation would be left out, maybe the result would be different.
That's a big if, however. What protections are there for media freedom in the Czech Republic?
Well, the problem of the media in Czech Republic is the fact that there is a lot of media being owned by our prime minister through his company. He owns a lot of the press. However, I think our media, for example, the public radio or public television, are still independent. So I think the situation in Czech Republic is actually not that much lost as it is in, for example, Hungary or maybe even Poland. So I think we are in a better position right now. The problem is that our prime minister is trying to hide his ownership of the media through some sort of lawyer's construction, but it is pretty obvious that he actually has a big influence on certain media houses.
As we speak, Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident and activist who was poisoned while in Siberia, is recuperating, or so we hope, in a Berlin hospital. And this has stirred some demands on the part of German officials, including some in Angela Merkel's party, to link Russian cooperation with exploring this crime against him to completion of the gas pipeline that will make Europe, some people think, dangerously dependent on natural gas from Russia. Do you think that should be done? Do you think it might be done? What is your view about this growing dependence for energy and the growing misbehavior of Putin in a kind of brazen and undisguised way?
Well, I don't think in general I don't think it's a good idea to be dependent on such regimes. But I believe that this is also some sort of, well, maybe not side effect, maybe it's one of the, in fact, primary effects in the changing the course towards the more greener technologies, more greener energy, because that also means that you don't have to buy the things from the dictatorship regimes, being it Russia, but you could find also some of the regimes in the Near East, for example, but also other all around the world. So I believe that is in fact one of the things why we should really focus on the innovations in this area, and to make our energy consumption more greener, because that also means that you will be less dependent on the authoritarian or dictatorship regimes.
A few moments ago, I used the phrase democracy recession. A worry that a number of people have about democracy in Europe, threatened by some illiberal populist movements, but also in the United States. How does the United States, as a democracy, as a free and vibrant society, look today to the people of the Czech Republic?
Well, I think the situation in US is for some people in Czech Republic not simply understandable nowadays, because the situation got quite more complicated than it was in the previous years. And we will see how the next presidential elections will result. But I think that a lot of people is kind of confused by the current course of the things.
A lot of Americans feel that after the misadventure, as many Americans think of it, in Iraq, and the failure there, as many Americans see it, of democracy promotion, that promoting democracy is really not something we know how to do, and we should step back from trying to do that. Would you care to comment on that? I mean, is that too pessimistic? Do we know how to promote democracy? And if so, is the United States still a plausible and effective promoter of democracy?
Well, I was really not prepared for this question. This is a very, very complicated one. I think about this as it means that the change has to come basically from the inside, because otherwise you could see that it could result in disastrous results. You could see the examples all around the world. However, for example, if you look at the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, you could see a fine example of the change coming from inside. The problem obviously was the fact that the regime was not able to deal with the challenges of that time, so it simply got disintegrated from the inside. And what we should take care about nowadays is that we should solve the problems of our countries before there will be a populist that will come with some instant nice looking but ultimately wrong solution to the problem. And the reason how we could defy that is by solving the problems before this happens. And that's the best defense against the populism, which could result in a dictatorship or other decomposition of the democracy.
Are you, on balance, optimistic, pessimistic, or neither about the future of democracy, including solving what's been called the democracy deficit within the European Union?
Well, I'm definitely an optimist in this way. However, the fact is that if you look at Czech Republic, or including Czechoslovakia, you could see that these countries spent, in fact, more than half of the last century in a certain form of dictatorship, either being the one coming from the east or the one coming from the west. This is, I understand it. It actually might be a little bit harder than we see it right now, but it's definitely worth the fight. I would like to enjoy the democracy as long as possible.
Well, as an elected mayor, I'm sure that's true. What, in your judgment, is what keeps you up at night? What worries you at 3 a.m. in the morning about the future of Europe, of your country, or of democracy in the world?
Well, right now it's mostly COVID-19, but if I would leave that out, perhaps, the thing that worries me is the fact that we have to be sure that the train will not leave the station without us in the area of technological innovations, I would say. That means we have to stay up to date in this field, and that's the way how we could survive in the global competition. So that's the thing that bothers me most, because that's the way from where the wealth comes.
You mentioned COVID-19. It has been called, this pandemic, an accelerant of some trends that were already underway and a retardant of other trends that were underway, globalization and all the rest. How do you think the world will be changed 2-3 years from now from having gone through COVID-19?
Well, I'm trying to look at this in a positive way, but however, the first thing that is very obvious to a lot of people now is, once again, that we should not rely on China too much, because it's not very good idea in a strategic way. That's the first thing. So there was the conference on supply chains in Taipei that I have attended during my recent visit to Taiwan, and there is a certain amount of people who see the very, very obvious problem as it is. The second thing is that it is obvious that this coronavirus situation have helped a lot to the remote way of work. So I think that, for example, a lot of things, it helped a lot of people to see that actually we can do a lot of things online, although they could not imagine that in the previous time. But because we have been forced to do that during the coronavirus crisis, now they know that this is possible, and this opened a whole field of new possibilities for the for making the public service more digital. So that's the better side of the story. Of course, there are downsides. Czech Republic hasn't been affected by thousands of deaths from the coronavirus so far. So we do not have this negative impact here. However, of course, the quarantine, the restrictions for the public events, limits on the amounts of people in one place, it makes the life a lot harder, obviously.
Mayor, we began our conversation today talking about Taiwan. Let's go back there as we close. You did some medical studies, I believe, in Taiwan. You know the place well. When you were there recently, tell us what the mood of the place is. They live on the lip of a volcano, in a sense, with an angry and increasingly bellicose large neighbor. How are they bearing up? How are their spirits?
Well, I have to say the people of Taiwan are still very hospitable people. They are very friendly. That haven't changed since 2005, and I hope it will not change in the future. That's the first thing. Of course, the Czechs do have also experience about having a neighbor that is much bigger than you, and a neighbor or almost neighbor who tries to his power on you. So I think we feel a lot of sympathy as Czechs for this island due to our personal experience in the history. And I think that really Taiwan is also one of the countries that I would really recommend anyone to visit. It's got a really nice combination of the cities and the nature, and really nice people. So I think they're doing just fine still.
Well, Mayor Hazib, I want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. It will be enjoyed by a large number of viewers. I want you to know, as I hope you do know, that you have many admirers around the world, not least of all in Washington, from which I'm speaking today, and that we wish you and your city and the Czech Republic all the best, and hope to talk with you again soon. Thank you for making this possible.
Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Will, and thank you, Mayor Hryb, for bringing us the perspective from Prague. It is now my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Colleen Bell, who is the Executive Director for the California Film Commission, and Director Yevgeny Afinevsky, to give us a perspective on how art is a beacon for democracies. Over to you, Ambassador.
So democracy isn't perfect, but I believe it offers the best framework for government. Living in a democratic state provides multiple paths to justice and to personal success, and ideally, recognition that all human beings are equally worthy. But you know, there's so many threats to democracy, it's very difficult to choose just two of them. But to highlight two, I would say that voter apathy is one of the most significant threats to democracy, at least in this country. You know, people really need to vote and to cast an informed vote. When people do not understand that their freedom is inherently linked to this responsibility and they fail to vote, others gain the power to enact their own agendas. So all citizens must exercise their right to vote, and we need to support measures that support voter protection. I also believe the problem of misinformation and disinformation online is vexing governments and societies around the world. We've seen in the United States how this can skew the political discourse and influence voter decisions. You know, what is worrisome is that, you know, the technology to deceive continues to improve. You know, verifying authentic content online will only become more difficult, raising its potential to sow social discord and lower people's trust in their institutions. You know, these trends are a concern for advanced economies, but they're also a warning of an immediate crisis in emerging and developing economies where institutions are more fragile and access to unlimited data is not always available. So, in short, you know, the protection of citizens depends on access to high quality information, access to broadband, and also for governments to work with civil society and the private sector to develop rules to counter misinformation. So I'm sitting here in my office in Los Angeles, California, with a view of the Hollywood sign outside of my window. I am a strong believer that art and film have a unique and extraordinary ability to raise awareness of different cultures, promote social cohesion, and strengthen cultural relations. So no one should ever underestimate the transformative power that art can play in the world.
European Union leaders and Ukraine have failed to sign an historic free trade deal after a last-minute U-turn from Kiev.
I almost died in my life. So great lessons, what we just saw with Alexei Navalny, how he was poisoned and how so many other enemies of Kremlin were poisoned. And I experienced the same story for myself in 2015 with the release of Winter on Fire, but luckily doctor saved my life. It's not easy when you have movies which showing the truer face of actions of Russian government. It was a lot of situations which put me in the moments that I need to rethink what I'm doing. But I think what is important for every filmmaker is to bring values to the screen and educate people and bring the voices of people who need to be heard, like in my Syrian story or voices from Maidan, and being able to change something in this world, allowing these voices to be heard and seen through the big medium of the filmmaking. And in the same time, it's important to bring lessons that people can learn. I think the amazing lesson from Maidan being used in different places, from Venezuela to Nicaragua, Chile, Hong Kong. Unity that I never saw in my life, where you can see rich and poor, young and old, so all different social classes, all together with the people on Maidan, kind of. And that was another fascinating aspect that I never experienced. Seeing all social classes, the interesting combination of interface dialogue and all religious groups supporting the people and standing for the people without emphasizing the religious aspect. So nobody was trying to convert the atheists into the believers, which was fascinating. Like I said, from the beginning, church sheltered the students and then opened hospitals and shelters inside of the churches. I think at the beginning of Maidan, nobody was seeing the Kremlin interference. They saw how Putin tried to kind of take Yanukovych his direction, but the nation, realizing that it took them so much time to move out of this former Soviet Union. Remember, in 1991, Ukraine became an independent country. So for them, from 1991 to go into this 2013 kind of momentum, where they are already independent, where they already its own country, and not only that, they were moving towards more European Union, more advanced kind of opportunity. To see that Putin trying to, behind the closed doors, do some deals with Yanukovych in order to bring Ukraine back into kind of under the wings of larger Mother Russia, I think for the people, that was the scary moment. For the first time, I saw this division when families in Ukraine were divided into two parts. I saw how people, certain people, younger generation, were really alignment with Maidan and believes that Ukraine wants to be a part of European Union and they want to advance into the future. And another part of their own family, sometimes parents to the kids, didn't want to talk to them because they were influenced by the Russian TV, Russian national TV. It was fake news and things against me. Like, for example, Russia Today, the Russian channel, government channel, Kremlin channel, and Russian news agency Sputnik did a movie about me called Al-Qaeda in Hollywood. So again, it's a combination of, yes, there is a fear, there is a certain threat to your life, and there is an opportunity to make people, certain people, some people, to change their hearts and minds and to do something for this world that will be better for the future and for our kids.
Майдан – це голос народу. Голос народу – це голос Божий. Слава Україні!
Thank you, Ambassador Bell, and thank you, Yevgeny, for providing today's closing remarks. It's been a pleasure to host all of you. I would like to also take this opportunity to thank our supporters once more: NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Bell Helicopter, and American Friends of Czech Republic. Please tune in tomorrow as we cover all things digital. Use hashtag CEPA Forum and go to cepaforum.org to submit your questions for our panelists tomorrow. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.
There is a nation state which has declared war on all of Western-style democracy. And I think it's incumbent upon people who have some understanding of the problem to do what they can to help people fight back, to take the battle to the enemy.
The COVID-19 pandemic has made the transnational nature of disinformation crystal clear. Conspiracies about the virus's origins in one country surface across the Atlantic in an instant.
When we look back in 2016, despite many warnings from the expert community and despite a number of elections and referenda targeted by Kremlin's information aggression in Europe, the whole Europe was actually extremely passive in its policy solutions, and it started only with some more significant activity after the US elections in 2016 and the media attention around that.
Initially, the way we addressed the threat of disinformation was from a defensive posture. Just how do we protect ourselves? How do we root out the bad actors and the potential harms online? And more recently, I think it has progressed to the point of how do we do so in a way that doesn't undermine some of the core values that are essential to our democracy.
The top priority for the transatlantic digital agenda should be to establish a common set of guidelines and rules around data privacy and use that is rooted in democratic values and principles.
We know that it is a challenge. We have acknowledged it. And so you see now a lot more of the civil society, government, and industry working together to address the challenge.